The two main underlying business models in our portfolio are multi-sided platform marketplaces and startup studios. The purpose of this video is to raise awareness about the business model startup studios. We are here to speak about the various attributes of a startup studio, the proper way to build a successful startup studio, and lastly, the best steps for managing our studio. But what exactly do we mean when we say startup studio? The most important detail to remember about startup studios is that the product is the startup itself. And just like when we're developing a product, we need to first define the aspects and characteristics that the startup will require. Then, we can start manifesting the aspects that we have outlined by using a playbook. A playbook for a startup studio may consist of the following steps: recruit a core team and promote an entrepreneurial mindset, add shared infrastructure and in-house funding, generate ideas for the startup, or even act as a co-founder if it would be helpful, create multiple startups simultaneously, discard the ideas that don't work, reassign your team members to other projects, develop the ideas that work as spin-offs into dedicated organizations. A startup studio is beneficial because it allows us to explore different topics of interest and solve multiple problems at the same time. In a studio, we're trying to create a mini ecosystem, and an iterative process is needed in order for the ecosystem to be created and then work successfully. So, let's take a closer look at this process. In order for a process to be truly repeatable, it must be simple and straightforward. Therefore, this iterative process for creating a startup generating ecosystem can be translated into a motto that goes like this: grow, exit, repeat. Grow. You and your team basically become an engine for idea generation and validation, and you only build projects that you believe truly work. Exit. Then, you should exit after the startup either becomes a success or it fails. It's true. You need to let your ideas go sometimes, even if it hurts. Repeat. Come up with the next startup that could be a success. It's important that we keep the team together while implementing this process in order to make sure every step is done correctly. Eventually, we can grow the ideas that will become successful. This is when we can start to get an understanding of whether our startup studio is successfully generating startups or not. But how can we understand whether a startup studio we have built is a successful generator of startups or not? The answer lies in a few certain characteristics that a startup studio should have. Let's briefly review what these characteristics are. Sustainable. The studio can build multiple startups in succession over a long period of time. Efficient. The studio benefits from economies of scale and grows its knowledge base and its collective experience. Viable. The companies developed through the studio have well-paying clients, growth, etc. Anti-fragile. The studio recycles resources and reassigns people from failing initiatives. By ensuring our startup studio has these characteristics, we will automatically also be assembling a strong, talented team of startup builders. In a studio, the teams are all centralized in one virtual place, and we can assign them to startups in a flexible way so that ideas flourish. This is a crucial part of creating a successful startup studio. However, there are many more necessary things to consider in order to build a successful startup studio. Let's take a look at them. Keep the team motivated across various projects. Being that the team will be working on many different ventures, they will eventually have to let them go as certain startups start becoming independent from the studio. It is important that they are equally motivated for every venture they work on. Attract the right entrepreneurs, or, even better, nurture the people within the startup to become entrepreneurs, who will later become the CEOs of these startups. The latter is preferred, as we will have the chance to also mentor these CEOs that emerged from the hierarchy of the startup. Lastly, manage resource conflicts within the studio. When we're working on multiple ventures at the same time with a limited number of people, it's inevitable that there will be some conflicts. This happens as a result of multiple startups wanting to have access to the same person whose skills are essential for the success of each startup. All of these tips are essential factors that make up a successful startup studio. Once the startup studio has been built, our focus will be on managing it and the startups that are generated through it. This can be a tough task because keeping all the startups that we created together demands a specific type of leadership expertise. There are specific steps that need to be taken in order to properly manage the startup studio. These steps are: initiate the planning and building activities that need to be considered, incorporate and manage all the ideas the studio produces, hire and manage the core team, attract and select entrepreneurs, co-founders, CEOs, participate in the ideation stage and separate the wheat from the chaff by making go, no-go decisions on ideas that will eventually lead to successful startups. Mentor and lead all the startup staff. Following these steps will help us to continuously develop our startup studio so that it can generate more and more startups that flourish. And lastly, selecting the right ideas to convert into startups requires patience and knowledge. The longer we manage a startup studio, the more patience and knowledge we will acquire, and the better our choices will become. Now, there is no basic, guaranteed science for creating a sustainable startup organization, but there are some things to consider which can be helpful. We want to choose to build resilient startups rather than fragile unicorns. In other words, we are committed to results over promises. Here are some generic steps for a startup's generation: ideation, validation and making go, no-go decisions, initial build and spinning off entities, scaling and managing the portfolio. And some questions to be considered are our vision and strategy aligned with our long-term preferences? Is our preferred market attractive enough? Do we have access to the key people to start with? Can we get the initial capital to fund our first few ventures? Are we making proper use of the studio approach? Is our economical model realistic? Creating a startup entity can be a bit of a gamble sometimes. Following these steps and providing answers to these questions will help us be more aware of what we can do to facilitate a startup's success. You've made it to the end of the video, so let's briefly recap some of the key points. Startup studios are one of the key business models used at Status. The purpose they serve for us is to generate and build ideas into new startups that we believe will be successful. There is an iterative process we use to ensure our startup studio is running properly. This process can be translated into a motto: grow, exit, repeat. We generate and grow the ideas we believe will work, exit when the startup either succeeds or fails, and then repeat. Remember, to be successful, our startup studio should be sustainable, viable, efficient, and anti-fragile. These characteristics ensure that our startup studio team is made up of high-level entrepreneurs. Lastly, there are some key steps to follow when we are creating new startups. These steps are ideation, validation, making go, no-go decisions, constructing the initial build of the product or company, and scaling and managing the portfolio. No matter our experience level, the more conscious we are about multi-sided platform marketplaces and startup studios in our daily work, and the more we integrate their characteristics and metrics into our design approach, the more efficient we can become in leveraging these models for Status and building a more successful portfolio together. In the end, Status is the startup studio that creates multi-sided platform marketplaces.